Hello, I'm Dalton Delan. I'm a columnist for the Berkshire Eagle, and this is Eagle Reels, where we take you beyond the news. Our guest today, Andrew Aurand, Senior Vice President for Research for the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Andrew, welcome to Eagle Reels.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Recently, in the pages of the Berkshire Eagle, Clarence Fanto reported on meetings of the Stockbridge Low Income Housing Trust, where I brainstormed to deal with the fact that median housing cost in the area is $575,000, considerably above the national average. And according to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, get this, since 1970, home prices have eclipsed inflation by 150%. And then shifting over to the rental market, 8.85% a year inflation since 1980. You could do the math on this. Better yet, let's have Andrew do some of the math for us. Andrew, could you please set up the situation in affordable housing?
Sure. So at the National Low Income Housing Coalition, we're a national advocacy, policy, and research organization, and we very much focus on rental affordability and our rental housing needs among low income renters throughout the country. And, this is a national problem that, there's not any community has adequate affordable rental housing for the lowest wage workers and for the lowest income families. And that challenge does go up the income ladder to slightly higher income households in some markets as well. So it's gotten to be a very serious problem.
Andrew, the old rule of thumb was 30% of your income going to your housing. I think that for a long time now, probably for many of us, that hasn't obtained. But I think it has to obtain for low income housing. So can you tell us what's going on? And even on up on the income towards middle, what's going on? Where are we at? What's a family or individual looking at today?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. The traditional standard is that a family shouldn't spend more than 30% of their income on rent. That is something that is embedded into a lot of our federal and state housing policies when we implement rental housing programs. And the reality is that a lot of families pay more than 30%. A lot of families who don't receive any type of federal or state assistance for their housing. And so about half of renters today spend more than 30% of their income on housing. Even more seriously, or an even more serious situation are the quarter of renters, so one of every four that spends more than half of their income on housing. And the situation is really dire for extremely low income and very low income renters. And extremely low income renters generally have incomes below the poverty line. And about 3/4 of those extremely low income renters spend more than half of their limited income on rent. So they have very limited resources to begin with. And then most of that goes just to their housing. And we know from research that other organizations do that those renters, those low-income renters that spend so much on housing, they pay for their housing by sacrificing many other necessities like healthy food, medical care, transportation, educational attainment for their children. They sacrifice a lot just to be able to keep a roof over their heads.
Andrew, can you unpack, please, for our viewers, the roots of the crisis? Is it greedy landlords or any kind of landlords dealing with whatever they're dealing with as their financial realities? Is it employers who are underpaying wages? Is it housing supply?
That's a great question. I'm going to take the easy answer and say all of the above, but I'll explain it a little bit more. So, it is partly an income problem in that for a lot of low wage workers, their wages simply are not enough to meet a typical standard of living. And so wages in many areas do need to increase. Minimum wages in some areas hasn't increased in decades. So that is a serious problem where incomes do need to rise. At the same time, it's also a serious housing problem in that, and that housing problem can be unpacked into different types of problems. In some markets, there simply is not enough rental housing. Meaning, development has been constrained. There's been significant population growth, but development has not kept pace with that population growth. So many areas in California, for example, And so rents have just skyrocketed and have become really unaffordable. And extremely low income renters and very low income renters always struggle to pay their rent. But where supply has not kept up with demand, they struggle even more and they're squeezed even more. So that's one reason. Another reason is, in other markets, even where there might be housing available, it's priced at a level that extremely low income renters can't afford. And the reality is that the private market has a very difficult time serving extremely low income renters because what they can afford to pay oftentimes does not, pay enough for a landlord to be able to then maintain their properties. And so landlords aren't going to lower their prices low enough oftentimes for extremely low income renters. So there's multiple problems that feed into this affordability problem.
Andrew, you mentioned California. I spent a lot of time in the Bay Area where they're pushing homeowners developing tiny houses in their yards that people could rent. Post-pandemic, with the move to remote work, we hear about the conversion of office towers. I know, however, that comes with questions, right? Like the plumbing is all in the core. There are lots of questions. Abandoned factories. Are there any solutions, such as I've mentioned or other, that are showing promise that you would advocate for?
So it's a very complex problem. And so we have to approach it with multiple solutions and then all integrated together, it solves the problem. And so, a lot of the examples you gave would be examples of maybe say the private market, redeveloping buildings so they're now housing or developing new housing. And that's very important. Like in a market like San Francisco, more housing is desperately needed, right? And so, there's a very important role there for the private market. But the private market isn't necessarily providing that housing because there are significant constraints. And some of those constraints, like in California on the coast, would be, just land, the lack of additional land. But there's also a lot of jurisdictions that don't allow rental housing or make it very difficult to develop rental housing. And so some jurisdictions just artificially create barriers or constraints to that housing. And so that's one problem. So the private market needs to respond with increasing supply. Local jurisdictions need to allow rental housing to be developed. And so that's another piece of the puzzle. But then we also need state resources to help provide resources developers who are doing housing for very low and extremely low income renters. And then there's also significant need for federal resources, because the reality is, like I said earlier, the private market can't serve the lowest income renters. And most jurisdictions don't have the resources to address this problem on their own either. And so federal resources are really needed in two forms. One is rental assistance. In some markets, if you just gave assistance to renters, they could use that assistance in the private market and occupy housing. But then in other markets, like where the supply is tighter, we need development and we need subsidized development so that development can occur. And at the same time, those developers or owners can keep their rents low enough for extremely low income renters to afford.
Andrew, we know this is complex, and we know there could be, HUD has a role to play. You've mentioned states have a role to play, communities, but is there a particular place? I'm not sure how familiar you are with the Massachusetts market, but if you had to point to where can our viewers advocate for help and change? Would you, on a sort of a vertical scale, would you point more toward their locality, their state, or the feds, which is the hardest to look towards?
All of the above. So, there's definitely local actions that need to be taken. So in terms of, getting local jurisdictions to review their zoning codes, their building permitting process, and what might be a barrier to rental housing in that process. At the state level, there needs to be political will to increase resources for affordable rental housing. And then the same at the federal level. We need to build enough political will to invest adequately in our voucher program and in our subsidy programs like the National Housing Trust Fund. I'll say about Massachusetts, Massachusetts is a really unique example. Unlike many other states, Massachusetts has its own public housing program. It invests significantly into housing for extremely low income renters. But we don't see that across the board, like in many other states. And that's that is something that states need to consider to do. We recognize a lot of states don't have the resources to do that. So that's where the federal government's resources are important. And one of the things we point out in one of our annual reports, and I'm just going to use this as an example, is that Boston is widely known as a very expensive housing market, right? But every year when we look at the housing needs of extremely low income renters, every place has a need, every place has a shortage, but Boston has one of the least severe shortages. Odd way to put it, but there still is a shortage, but it's least severe, which is odd for an expensive housing market. But the reason why is because so many resources have been put into subsidized housing in Massachusetts and in the Boston area. And we see that in state resources. We also see that in old cities like Boston that existed. I mean, they were well established in the 50s and the 60s when we were investing in public housing. And that public housing still exists today, and it is still serving low income renters. And so that's why, an expensive market like Boston still has a shortage, but it's not as severe as it is in some other places.
That's really fascinating, because that starts to point to this issue of a lot of the service people, workers, and so forth, who are employed in those areas, such as Stockbridge, which I mentioned at the beginning. They may have to endure really long commutes. I suppose it's not even out of the question to come from Boston suburb, as you illustrated, where perhaps someone can afford to live, to do whatever work is best available, even into the Berkshires. Any advice for our viewers who are struggling at all with how to accommodate this combination of too expensive rental housing where they're working and long commutes? Any particular thoughts, any solutions you've seen in markets?
Sadly, for individual solutions. So if I'm a renter, who's working a very low wage job and I'm trying to find rental housing, sadly, in most communities, there's not a lot of options and there's not a lot of individual solutions. I will say that Massachusetts is also unique in that it's one of the few states, there's a couple of others, that has a search tool, has a really good, I think it's called the Massachusetts Housing Navigator, where, if you're low income and you're looking for rental housing, you can use that tool to try to find rental housing in your community. And it's a really good tool because in some places it's even hard to find where that housing is located. But the reality is that there's not a lot of individual solutions because it's really a community and a societal problem, and this lack of political will to provide that low cost housing. And so we really need, and this is happening in many places, we really need a stronger movement to encourage elected officials to put more housing into resources. And tenants are organizing. I mean, there is a growing tenant organizing movement across the country. Tenant unions are forming, and they become fairly strong in some areas, that they're really having an impact on local and state policy, recognizing that an individual renter cannot solve this problem on their own. And they really need to build that political will and get involved in the political process. And I will say, regarding, low wage workers, and again, referring to Massachusetts, Massachusetts in general is considered a very expensive rental housing market. I think our Out of Reach report identifies it as the third most expensive state in the country. And even within, though, Massachusetts, there's of course very expensive housing markets like Boston. In the western part, though, of Massachusetts, rental housing appears to be a lot less expensive, right, compared to, say, Boston. But the reality is the low wage workers in these areas struggle regardless, because places that tend to have lower rents also tend to have lower wages in general. So the low paying jobs, say in Pittsfield or elsewhere, those low wage jobs are paying lower than the low wage jobs in Boston. So no matter where the low wage worker goes, they're going to struggle to afford their rental housing.
So Andrew, if you were in our digital metaverse here, if you were in that brainstorm of the Stockbridge Low Income Housing Coalition, is there one piece of advice you'd give them to think about to help cure the problem in our area of the Berkshires?
Oh, that's a great question. I would say, I'm going to sort of put on my organizing hat, not my research hat, but I would say trying to organize and vote elected officials who see affordable rental housing as a significant problem. There's a lot of people who don't see it as a problem. The reality is it is a problem for millions and millions of families. And we need to elect officials who see that as a problem.
What keeps you up at night and what gives you hope?
Whoa, those are really good questions. So I think what keeps me up at night currently, I mean, things change over time, but the significant increase in homelessness that we've seen in recent years, it's become, homelessness has been a problem for a long time, but it seems like in recent years, in a number of communities, it has grown significantly, like beyond pre-pandemic levels. And we're very slow to respond to that. So that, combined with the fact that there appears to be a lot of places that are criminalizing homelessness, like not allowing tents to be in certain areas, not allowing homeless to congregate or to develop some type of community. It's the growing numbers of homeless combined with the criminalization of homelessness and sort of the negative stereotypes that are out there about people who are experiencing homelessness are really troubling. When the reality is, many times people who are homeless, they're not homeless because of their own actions. They're homeless because their community doesn't have enough housing. And unfortunately, too many times, people who are experiencing homelessness are blamed for their homelessness. It's a structural housing market problem.
And what gives you hope?
I think, we have seen, significant growth and awareness of the need for affordable rental housing. We've had this lack of political will for a long time to fully address the problem. We still don't fully have the political will to address the problem, but there's been growing awareness, and I think that political will is growing. And we've definitely have seen it among tenants themselves organizing, developing tenant unions and trying to influence the political process, recognizing that, we just don't invest enough as a society into our housing programs. So that gives me hope.
Wonderful. Andrew Aurand, thank you for joining us on Eagle Reels and for the work you do. And viewers, if you're already a subscriber to the Berkshire Eagle, thank you. If you're not yet a subscriber, please consider a subscription. This is how you maintain what we do, local journalism in America, sorely needed in this country. Thank you for joining us today on Eagle Reels. I'm Dalton Delan. I'll see you next time and in the pages of the Berkshire Eagle.